Hello, you're listening to Queer Everything, a queer of color podcast about thriving in the world while being at odds with it. I'm Lena Rafiq Sheikh.
One of the things that I love about doing this podcast is that it is an opportunity to have conversations with people that I've just been itching to have. This one is no exception. My guest in these next episodes is named Joe Steele. Besides having a wonderful spy-worthy name, Joe is a colleague and a mentor with whom I enjoy working immensely. I met him when I was just getting started doing organizational culture change work. I was shadowing him as he was working with a group of university professors, when in his role as facilitator, he offered a little information about himself. He said, "I'm gay," which I knew about and took an instant shine to him for. He said, "It's hard for folks to place where I'm from," which was true. He could have told me that he was anything from Latin American to North African to Middle Eastern, Southern European, or Indian, and I would have believed him. He said he's mixed race and the child of a Black Catholic priest and a white nun. And then he moved on. And I was like, whoa, wait, I want to hear more. Luckily for me, Joe told his story in a book called Forbidden Love, the true love story of a Black priest and white nun who defied the church and society, written by Lisa Jones Gentry as told by their son, Joe. The book is a moving account of their relationship, truly a love story, that took place after Joe's parents met in 1950s upstate New York. It also talks about his adoption by the very loving Steele family in Cincinnati and his journey learning about his history as he connected with his birth mother later in life. I've been curious about Joe's experiences as a Black identified gay man growing up in Cincinnati, about being a young man in New York City in the 1980s, and ultimately leaving the corporate world to become an independent consultant for reasons that were not unrelated to his being gay, like with me. This is what we talk about in today's episode. I was also eager to hear more about his extraordinary adoption story and his journey around it, and we get into that more in the next episode. This conversation was just such a blast, and I'm delighted to be sharing it with you. And we're recording. I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome Joe Steele. Joe is a colleague whom I got to know when I started doing organizational culture change work, which includes, especially these days, a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion work. So Joe, you and I have worked together, and I always love working with you. And the first time we facilitated together, you alluded to your background and story, and I was just fascinated. And you published a book about it in the last year or so, and I'm really excited to hear more about your journey. First off, will you introduce yourself briefly to our listeners?
Yeah, hi, I'm Joe Steele. I am currently residing in the Hudson Valley, New York. I have been with my now husband, we formally got married in 2015, for 31 years. We just celebrated our 31st anniversary. Like Lena said, she and I have been colleagues and have worked together and have shared quite a bit, actually, in our journey of both being, well, her word's queer. I'm still getting used to that, and we can be in that conversation while we're on the podcast. And really just sort of looking forward to having a conversation with someone I have a lot of respect for. I grew up, because I identify as Black American, mixed race, adopted, and again, Lena alluded to the book that's out called Forbidden Love that talks a lot about my adoption story. But in that, I was raised by a Black family, and I was raised in a working class community.
I feel like that's actually a good starting place, because when I mentioned to you that the podcast was called Queer Everything, you told me that you were still getting used to how that word queer has been reappropriated. So I'm just curious where you are with that and what your experience with that has been.
Well, one of the things Lena and I also share in common is we work with an organization called Visions. One of our key tools is guidelines. And one of the guidelines is to try on, particularly in being in cross-cultural dialogue. And to respond to your question, the use of the word queer is still very much of a try-on for me. You may have picked up in my introduction, having been with my husband now for 31 plus years, I am in my 60s now. And so growing up, so we talked about my period of coming out, which would have been the late 60s going into, the 70s. Mm. Queer was derogatory. It was sort of in the same milieu in terms of like impact as being called a faggot. So it's still a real struggle even to try on the use of the word, because I totally understand how it means something very different to the younger generations. And it still brings back a lot of just memories of my past in hearing the word. So I guess my challenge in the try on is really to embrace the meaning now and the comfort in which it's being used relative to some of the trauma that is still sort of in my mind and brain from my life experiences growing up with hearing the word queer and being called the word queer, having close friends of mine being called the word queer.
I hear that. If you're open to it, one of the things I'd love to ask you about is your journey into realizing about your sexuality in that period, and just how that went and how things evolved. You've seen a lot of change over the course of your life and been in a lot of places. So if you're open to it, I would love to hear you speak more about that.
Actually, and again, this is sort of talk that Lena and I have, and we talk about intersectionalities of people differences. And I think this is where gender differences at an early age possibly come into play, because I basically realized I had an interest in same-sex probably by the age of 10. And given the gender separations often between boys and girls, I often had boys around me. And then also, I don't know if you call it physiological or just differences in, or sexual awareness, you might say, between boys and girls. So between sort of having boys around me a lot who, if nothing else, wanted to quote unquote play around or mess around, that started by the time I was 10.
So it was around a lot, it sounds like.
Around a lot, and of course, all hidden at that point. This wasn't like anything, we would be sharing with anybody else besides the two of us type thing. And at the same point, back to the pressures that I was still feeling, and again, back to even the word queer. The last thing I wanted to be called was a queer or a faggot. And that would start with my family or anyone else outside of my family. That I still lived a heterosexual life for the most part. I mean, I was dating girls, and that was the time of free love, so everything else that went with that. So I wasn't thinking of myself as gay. I was just really thinking of myself as someone who happened to like to have sex with boys as well. So it wasn't really an acceptance of sort of, well, first of all, the thought of being queer and gay was like the furthest thing from my mind, because there were no role models, and I didn't want to start a future for myself that seemed like it was only going to be problematic. And then also, while my families, who probably knew that I had this interest, I knew that they wouldn't be approving if I was even going to be considering that. So it was really more just the sexual aspects of it. And the rest of it was pretty much living a heterosexual life.
I feel like that's a very common experience, including for many people still in the parts of the world that I come from and grew up in. So I hear that. Remind me, you grew up in Cincinnati, was it?
Cincinnati, Ohio.
You talked about having this interest, knowing you had this interest, keeping it to yourself, and then living a heterosexual life otherwise. When did that change for you?
It started to change in my senior in high school, because one of my closest friends, who was also one of my playmates, so to speak, he had already started coming out. Back then, particularly if anyone had even the perception of quote-unquote effeminate ways, you were queer or you were gay or you were a faggot. And he definitely demonstrated, enough that even people in my family would make the comment, not calling him queer or faggot, but he's light in the loafers. So that was sort of, I guess, supposed to be a gentler way of calling someone queer or faggot. And it wasn't said favorably. Yet, to my family's credit, they never discouraged my relationship, never talked like really bad. My friend's name is Chris, or never talked bad about him either. So I think because of my association with Chris, my family, because they knew his family, there was a level of permission I had to continue to be around Chris and develop a relationship with Chris. And Chris was definitely much further on his journey of accepting his sexual orientation than I was. I mean, both of us were still living a heterosexual life, because Chris was, the cat's meow with the women, with the girls, I should say, back then. Yet he was still gay enough and knew it. And Chris had already also started going back and forth to New York. So by the time he was in his junior year in high school, because of his connects with a wealthy family, and he knew their kids well, and they went back and forth to New York quite a bit. Chris went with them. So Chris, and Chris was determined he was going to go to Parsons as well. So I say all that to say, because of Chris's comfort in his own skin, Chris starting at that age to get familiarity with going back and forth to New York, he brought that energy to me. So it made me realize that I could have a gay life, and it was definitely not going to be in Cincinnati, at least not at that point in time, praise the Lord. And it would be in New York, because Chris had created this life for him that I was vicariously living through. So that gave me hope. And so I was determined to get out of Cincinnati for school. So I was fortunate enough to I actually got into Columbia and got into Harvard. And was actually on my way to New York, because remember, I want to go to New York, because Chris is going to be going to New York the following year. He was a year behind me in school. And I wanted to go to New York. Fortunately, and this is a story that's in the book, the singer Nancy Wilson, she's from Ohio, and so my tennis coach knew her. This is my high school tennis coach. So anyway, we went to a concert of hers one night, and so I was gung-ho and going to New York, so I was going to be going to Columbia, and so he was telling her that I had turned down Harvard. I had turned down Harvard, but I wasn't going to go to Harvard because I wanted to be in New York. And she turned to me and says, baby, you're too young to have a regret like that at starting in your life at such a young age, so I would not turn down Harvard if I were you. Oh, wow. And it sort of hit me like a ton of bricks. And it was enough emphasis for me to know that the education was going to give me a lot more freedom in terms of being out and gay. And the best education I could get, I at least had the wherewithal to somewhat pick that up. Again, I'm a teenager, but, destined for New York. But her words just struck me in such a way that I went to Harvard. And fortunately at Harvard, New York was just beyond Westchester County, in terms of like my abilities to go back and forth. So and Chris was now in New York. And so that's what allowed me to now officially start coming out. So this would have been my freshman year in college. And then by, pure coincidence, because I was not comfortably out at Harvard, particularly my freshman year, because my freshman year, because you live collectively, with all other freshmen, and I'm like, it's enough being there from a socioeconomic class perspective and everything else, let alone to be out. And I happened to I got to a club in Boston, probably the fall of my freshman year. This is a gay club, because I had only been going to gay clubs. Now I started in my senior year in high school. Cincinnati had a gay club called Badlands, so I started finally breaching the waters and not being as scared about someone seeing me. Once I got to Boston, no one knew me from Adam, so I was definitely out at the gay clubs. And again, mind you, we're talking about, this is 1976, so this is like when the clubs are really starting to just truly be an oasis and a mecca for the gay, particularly for the male gay community. And because I want to emphasize, being a man, I think also influenced my life experiences with my journey. And so anyway, make a long story short, I end up meeting this guy who was actually a graduate school at Harvard in the School of Education. And he had a whole gay posse. And these were also people of color, because I want to bring this in, because my experience and an affirmation of my experience was because I happened to also have other Black folks and also other people of color who were my mentors early on, because that's always been an ongoing challenge for me is, I've got white gay friends and white male gay friends. There is a different life experience, because at the end of the day, there's still white men. And I think as a person of color, I was fortunate enough to have people of color who were my mentors, because these were other guys in graduate school. So they helped me survive the undergrad, because again, they were at another point in their life. So socially, I was hanging mainly with them. And then I kept somewhat of I wouldn't call it a straight profile amongst my colleagues in undergraduate, because at that point I wasn't dating women anymore. But the point is, I wasn't out either. My social life was sustained by these guys, and then again going back and forth to New York and then St. Chris. So by the time at the end of my freshman year, I was pretty much out for me. Let's just put it that way. Yeah.
That sounds amazing, and I'm glad to hear that you found queer community or gay community of color when you were an undergrad. That's actually an experience that I think even now some students lack. So that's great to hear. So I'm curious about a couple of things. I may or may not put this in the final edit of the podcast. If you're willing to share, knowing now that there's still things at the intersection of race and class and sexuality that are really hard, I'm curious about what your experience was like from that standpoint.
Well, one of my refrains is God works in strange ways, because it was a mixed experience. And The person I lived with my freshman year was a Puerto Rican from working class background out of New York. And we were, good friends, good roommates. And I never officially came out to him. He caught me a couple of times, but it was never a conversation we had. And nor was he ever passing judgment. And my choice point, though, was to sort of keep distance in our relationship, which is a real regret I have, because he ended up leaving Harvard after his first year. So a lot of it was just the culture, it wasn't working for him, and some other stuff going on for him. And so that's a loss and a regret that I still have, because he and I were going to be roommates the following year, because back then Harvard had a lottery system for the housing. And so we had actually gotten into our first choice, which is Adams House, which was definitely, quote unquote, the house where the gay folks lived, as well as the pre-med students. The pre-med because of its proximity to the campus, and the gay folks because that's where a lot of gay folks live. So you're going to find other people like you, right? So in any event, he was gone. And the way this works is that if you're now by yourself and you're not part of your housing group that originally went into the bidding process for the house, you will be randomly assigned to a housing group with somebody else in the house. And being gay, I was like, that's the last thing I want, is to be randomly assigned. That's why I say God works in strange ways. One night I'm over having dinner in Adam's house while I'm still a freshman, getting used to the house. And there was somebody in the house who I knew, like, from the clubs, an older student, just letting them know, lamenting about, oh my God, they're going to randomly assign me, and I'm gay and I don't know how this is going to work. And I'll never forget this. He points to this white guy, blonde hair, sitting across the room, whose name is Stephen Hayes. He has since passed away. And he said, he's in the same position you are. He's gay. He doesn't have a roommate. Why don't you go talk to him? And so literally that evening, I took my tray, walked over to his table, plopped it down, introduced myself, and told him I understand we're in the same situation, and we both share something in common. And back then, the expression that the gay community would use, and I don't know if it's still happening now, is friends of Dorothy. Like that was from The Wizard of Oz, and the whole sort of stereotype.
Judy Garland.
Yeah, Judy Garland. Exactly. So I plopped my tray down. So we're talking. Make a long story short, he was totally open to it, and we stayed roommates for the next 3 years. So he not only helped me have a really positive relationship with a white gay man while still being able to be my black self, because he was very comfortable in his own skin and had no issue with the comfort in mine. So he met my friends, I met his friends, and it made the next 3 years at Harvard palpable, because a sadness I have is, while I'm really close to the black alums, so people who were in my class, and a few of the Latin folks as well, in not being out, even fast forward to now in my life, I'm still coming out to them. So that's, in fact, the woman who wrote the book is a woman named Lisa Jones Gentry, who was a classmate of mine, actually lived in Adam's house too. And we were like acquaintances. I wouldn't call us close friends. And I had never formally been out with her until I got her to read my draft that I had put together on the memoir. And then, she ultimately put it together and wrote it for me, that I really came out with her. So I just say it because there's a piece of my Harvard experience that I'm still completing with some of the folks, particularly some of the black community who I knew but wasn't formally out. And for the most part, I must say, folks have been overwhelmingly cool. And if anything, sad that I didn't feel comfortable enough to come out. And I also feel sad because it really probably limited the relationships we could have developed while we were actually in school. I mean, the class system at Harvard, it was sort of wild, because I went to a Jesuit prep high school in Cincinnati, which had that very, very fluent folks, in terms of from the families and stuff. So I had already worked out my working class background relative to being around money. So, and I was fortunately super prepared academically to perform at Harvard. Now, from a gay perspective, though, and a white gay male perspective, I actually was acquaintances and friends with super rich white gay men, which I think is also, a luxury in terms of what they would include me in at their expense, which I appreciated. And also, I think it helped me manage my own emotions sometimes, being around white gay men who are fluent, because there tends to be, at least in some of the circles I'm in, and, think about, because I've served on the board of Gay Men's Health Crisis, and then also some of the other social circles, Human Resource Campaign, HRC, et cetera. Full of wealthy white gay men. So I think some of my early on experiences helped me still navigate this and also not get hooked as much with what is still a frustration, which is the discomfort and insensitivities, for the most part, these are generalizations, of when sexism and racism get brought up and just feeling like they're missing in action.
Right, right.
Because I've not come to expect much because of these early experiences, right? Not to make excuses for it, but on the flip side, it, like I said, it helps me manage my expectations while still be able to have a decent relationship with these folks.
That's an interesting way to put it. Helps you manage your expectations. That's a really healthy way to look at it.
I try, Lena.
I also really resonated with what you said about moving halfway across the country from Cincinnati to Boston and nobody knowing you and having real freedom to be yourself, at least around your circle of peers and in the gay clubs. What happened after you left Harvard? Where did you go?
No, take a guess, Lena.
Beeline to New York City like me. I did the same thing.
Beeline doesn't do it justice.
Yeah.
Well, like I said, I lived just beyond Westchester County when I was living in Boston. So I was back and forth, looking for the best deal and the cheapest way to get there, probably every other week. Fortunately enough, I had gotten a job the summer. So this is the end of my junior year. So I fortunately got a job at Chase Manhattan Bank. So that gave me a summer with money because they paid you really well. This is a bank, right? And they were trying to get their affirmative action together. Because as an aside, I'm an affirmative action baby. That's why I'm just, it's a whole other conversation. But I think it's relevant from a gay perspective too, because my affirmation as a gay man would not be where it's at if I hadn't also been a beneficiary of what was going on back in those days related to affirmative action. So anyway, thanks to affirmative action, the bank trying to get its representation numbers up, particularly with black folks, I went into a program that had all black folks and a couple Latin folks, it was about 24 of us, hired by the bank because they could include us in their annual numbers. And then to their credit, it was a way for them to check us out, us to check the bank out, etc. And so I met a great group of folks. I wasn't out to them. So back to this whole thing of also passing, which is another piece of this conversation. And fortunately, it gave me a chance to see that I could live and work in New York and not lose my mind as well, because that was always a scare I had. And I think some of it has to do with my into astrology, that Aries in me who's going to make things work, and that Pisces who sometimes can not know when enough's enough. And New York has always been a fast lane city with somebody who likes to keep their toes in the fast lane and hope and pray not to get carried away by the current. So
I can only imagine what it was like to be a young gay fella in New York in the late 70s.
Oh, yeah, because it really is. I guess even to still be here to, alive to talk with you in this podcast.
Yeah.
And back to the summer, didn't have me permanently moving to New York. So it gave me a chance to sort of prove to myself that I could make this work while still having the discipline to do it in a way that I could possibly survive this, right, without losing my mind. Because, there was a lot of people losing their mind, and I could have easily been one of them. Let's just put it that way. Temptation was rampant in every way as you can imagine. So that was an important experience for me. And it also got me and the bank acquainted with each other, because when I graduated from college, because of my bank experience, I knew that there was this program called Credit Audit, 2-year program that trained you to be a loan officer at the bank. And then before you took on a loan officer assignment, you traveled the world as an internal credit auditor for the bank. So I would have never known about this program if I hadn't worked at the bank and realized it. And then also the power of the network, because there was a black woman that I had met who was actually at the business school while I was an undergrad, who I had gotten to know. And she happened to be part of that program too. So she had been talking to me about this. So anyway, make a long story short, how I ended up going back to New York was because I had actually gotten accepted into the business school right out of undergrad. Pretty much is unheard of because Harvard didn't like they want to expand their alumni population, not keep one in multiple schools, right? Along with the fact that you generally are supposed to have a lot of work experience, which I had thanks to Chase and some other jobs I had in my summers as well. And then because I knew that there was this job, again, I didn't let Chase know this, because the deal with Chase is it was 2 years and you were going to go on and be a lending officer. It wasn't going to be 2 years and you were going back to business school, right?
Right.
But anyway, making a long story short, I took a deferred admit. Now I'm at the end of my undergraduate. I'm now in New York. And that was a struggle to get through the training program because the training program is 9 months. And I'm now full-time in New York making money. And New York was in fifth gear in this period. Because we're talking about like 79, 80. So it took a lot of discipline. Some days I was better than others, I must admit, and managed to get through the program and to hide the fact that I was going to business school because they would have kicked me out the program, right? So anyway, come June, so about a year was the training program. Come the following June, the next thing I know, I am literally traveling around the world, first class, as this auditor. So now I've got my home base in New York, and these are 4 to 6 week trips because you're going to audit up the portfolio of that particular country. So the next thing I know, I'm spending time in Brazil. That's how I fell in love with Brazil. My first big audit was to Brazil. I'm over in Milan. I'm in back and forth to London, back and forth to Argentina, to Chile, to Nigeria. I mean, as this young kid, which from a global perspective, I love because from a gay perspective, and also you alluded to this earlier of, just getting out of Cincinnati. I mean, once I got out of New York, I love that about New York, how you keep your anonymity, because that gives you an added level of being able to be yourself from a gay perspective without worrying, right? I mean, nobody knows you from Adam, and most part, you're not ever going to see most folks ever again, right?
Right.
And then you get out of the U.S., and now, it was a whole nother world because you got all these different cultures, which I think came with a lot of excitement and a lot of sadness, depending on what country, because Brazil was just finishing a military dictatorship. And fortunately, it was somewhat gay friendly, somewhat in terms of at least access to people in relationships. But a lot of these countries did not have that access. So I guess it gets back to while I love the global aspects of what I was getting in terms of the cultural competencies, from a gay perspective, it probably reinforced the significance of staying in the closet.
Right.
Now, fortunately, I work with people, and again, culture does matter. I'm talking about our own audit culture, that what you did at night was strictly your business because we're in a small conference room all during the day. So the underlying cultural norm was whatever you do in the evening, and they were not like, let's get together and have dinner types. Folks wanted their own time. We'd been together all day. So that really worked for me. So as a result, I could explore what might be. Certain places was popping. London was popping with the gay life. And some of these other places, but most of them were really repressive. And it did give me a chance, though, to realize that the global piece was really going to work for me. And on the flip side, it was going to put more and more constraints on me in terms of being out. And also how quickly I found myself being pressed about coming out because the United States, it's true, but not so much in New York, but again, depending on what part of the U.S. you're in, people will often ask you, are you married? Do you have children? Get out of the United States. A lot of these countries, you're sitting with people on the plane and they're asking you this.
Yeah. Total
Strangers. And back then I did not feel comfortable with being out. And I think it really reinforced it's not okay to be out. So even though I'm living the life in New York with all this global travel, it's not okay to be out. And actually, it ended up adversely impacting my career at the bank because I went to business school. I was sort of out in business school. I really didn't care at the business school that much. And then when I came out of business school and went back to New York, from a work perspective, well, the one job, my boss was gay, and I knew he was gay going in, so that was cool. But once I left that and went back into banking, I didn't come out. Well, I think my boss definitely knew I was gay, and living in New York City, I was definitely out, but not at work. And I think that really impacted my professional life because, particularly investment banking, because a big piece of investment banking is socialization.
Right.
And so needless to say, I was socialized, yet never have somebody with me. And then when asked, either make up something, so lie, and or just basically not go and be social. Which and the not go and be social is where I really got burnt because that was part of the job. So that I think was probably one of the biggest catalysts once I finished investment banking. I got downsized, not because of anything gay. Well, actually, yes, it was because I didn't get a promotion that I should have. And I think a lot of that was because I wasn't socializing it.
Right.
And then it was just sort of time. And then I had over-specialized in Brazil because Brazil was always where my heart was. Brazil was in its economic crisis. So as a result, I took severance pretty much with my compensation for a full year. And with that's sort of what got me into this diversity work. And I think that, being gay and like being in something that ultimately allowed me to feel comfortable in being out. And I say ultimately because when I started this DEI work, so we're going back now to 91. That's when I left banking, got the package, met my husband all at the same time. When I first started the DEI work, the primary focus, at least the organizations I was working in, because I was an independent consultant, their focus was mainly on race and gender. I mean, sexual orientation really hadn't come onto the scene. And with some of the firms I was working with, while I was out with them, I was discouraged from bringing that into the classroom.
Interesting. Yeah. And I'm not surprised.
Yeah. No, I mean, you don't want to turn people off with youth. I mean, this is coaching I'm getting from like contracting firms who are hiring me. You don't want to throw participants off. I mean, if they don't bring it up, you don't bring it up. Don't make this about you. And fortunately, I'm, I guess, intelligent enough and also realize I need to survive how to play this game. And it was still quite frustrating because because basically the message was it's not relevant. Again, this is from the consulting firm I'm working with, and thus I would assume either something the client said or something they feared the client would say.
Right.
And while we're on this, Lena, just as an aside, I started doing this diversity, equity, inclusion work in early 90s. Now we're in 2022. For the most part, I guess within the last 10, 15 years, pretty consistently I come out to groups.
Right.
And I can still count maybe on two hands and possibly one of my feet the number of participants that have come out in the group.
After you've come out?
After I've come out. Now, they might come up and say something to me offline, but it's I literally, I mean, and again, I'm talking about primarily from a corporate standpoint and a corporate
I see.
setting.
Yeah.
And this would be both in the U.S. and also outside the U.S. And so there's a real sadness. I think there's a real scare that the LGBTQ community still has, particularly the corporate setting.
Yes.
Got some level of work on the nonprofit side too, but I'm speaking from a corporate perspective, particularly companies claiming that they're inclusive, et cetera, et cetera. It just still leaves me wondering what's going on with a sense of safety for many of the LGBTQ community.
You're not wrong. And that's why I exited the corporate environment, because I couldn't be myself. I started in finance in New York in my early 20s, right?
I'm learning something completely new for you. No, who did you start with?
So it was a small currency trading brokerage. It wasn't one of the big investment banks. I started at a currency trading firm. You can imagine I was not their typical profile of person. I had a financial economics degree and international experience and dabbled in the currency markets at that point, pre-2008. So they hired me. And here's the thing. This was maybe 2003, 2004, 2005. Same thing as you're describing, except there was this socializing aspect. People would hit the bars afterwards, right? I remember we celebrated somebody's promotion and everybody went to a steakhouse. And then after I left, they went to the strip clubbing, right? And in that environment, the straight people were very comfortable talking about what they did on the weekend and their kids. It wasn't until years after I left that I realized that there were at least 5, 6 other gay people working in my division of like maybe 35, 40 people. And we just weren't out to one another or anybody else at the company. I caught up with a guy who I shared a car service home with for months, and we just never talked about who we were going home to.
I totally relate.
Yeah. So that's real. That was the early 2000s, and a lot of shifts happened then. And also, Joe, you were in New York in the 80s, and I can only imagine how that was.
Well, I started with all the fun, and then also just the the need to sort of have discipline because of so much fun.
Yeah.
And in the process, by the mid 80s when the AIDS crisis started, I lost, I can't even count now, but I mean, 3 immediately popped to mind of like brothers to me through the whole AIDS piece. And then the fact that I'm here talking to you is there I go for the grace of God, because my life wasn't that different than theirs.
Right.
And so what I think helped save me is that I gotten into relationships like that, particularly during the height of the whole AIDS crisis. I was in a relationship like for a 5-year period, so sort of covering like when it was really the pandemic stages of that. So I think that helped save me. But on the flip side, there's a lot of just sadness I have, even with being in that relationship. Because while on the one hand, the relationship saved me, on the flip side of that, what got me out the relationship, although it took me a while, was the scare that my partner had in me being in relationship with my brothers who were passing away.
Right.
Like that I was going to bring something home, and just decisions I ended up making to try to keep peace in the house at the expense of the relationships that I had with these guys. And I still have a lot of regret about that. I mean, ultimately, Chris, bring this story back to Chris, my childhood friend, was in New York, and he was in his final stages. And my partner was acting crazy, and it was like, I've had enough of this, and yes, if it's a pick and choose, Chris is like my ace boon coon, right? I mean, he is who I am today, and who I was then is a big function of what Chris brought out in me, right? So bottom line is, my partner was like, you're going to have to make a decision. And it was like, well, that's not a hard one with Chris. So, and I'm out of here, and praise the Lord, because it allowed us to at least have another year of a phenomenal relationship. And at that point, I actually moved to Brazil, because when I got separated from my partner, my boss, who, again, while I wasn't formally out, you can appreciate this, Lena, you were on the sales and trading floor. I mean, on the sales and trading floor, you're practically on each other's laps. So,
Yes.
You're right. So any conversation you had, you knew everybody else's business and they knew your business. I mean, that was sort of the way it worked. And since, these were long hours, friends were going to call, right? Invite you out to do something, whatever it might be, right?
Joe, are you familiar with the phrase trader's ear?
No.
Oh, I had it for years after I was in that environment, where I could be having a conversation like face to face with somebody and also knowing what's going on in 2 other conversations behind me. So yeah, I totally relate. And it creeps people out because they think I'm not paying attention.
Well, okay. Well, I'm going to actually start using that with my husband, Trader here, because he said that's my Mars and Gemini.
That also, yeah.
Because I am like into all these different conversations all around me.
Right.
In fact, as a total aside, I have to really be careful even in doing the work we do, because I'm so used to being, or at least listening in and sensing multiple conversations that I'll end up like bringing this into a large group of people who are trying to track me on one, and I'm like responding on like the other conversation I've been in.
It's good to know it's not just me. Yeah.
That is too funny, traders here. I got to remember that, Lena. So anyway, so my boss didn't know specifically what my relationship was, and knew that I had gotten, it was like a divorce. I mean, we had, we owned apartments together, and, I moved and blah, 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 blah. So an opportunity opened up in Brazil. So he arranged for me to go to Brazil. And so that was what also contributed to me end up being pushed out of the bank, because while I was in Brazil, to bring this back to AIDS, 3 of these brothers I'm talking about ended up passing away. So so I'm in Brazil for like a 1.5 year stretch, more or less. In that 1.5 years, I had to make, God knows, probably 8 to 10 trips back to the States. And these would be like long weekends, just either to say goodbye, go to a funeral. So needless to say, I was a basket case in Brazil. And then the markets had tanked. So the products we were selling, the whole thing was just a mess. And it still gave me a chance to, get out of that relationship, though, and, get my head together there. But in the process, to be away from these guys when they were really transitioning.
Right.
Because even in a long weekend trip, right, you can only, just have so much sort of saying goodbye time.
Right.
And it gave me a chance at least to try to make up for some of the regrets I had with this crazy ass lover, in terms of his scare that he had related to this and how I went along with it. So I guess to answer your question, the 80s, particularly in terms of, not only the fun of it, because the 80s was an incredible time. That was the height of the disco and all those other things that went with that. And then all of a sudden the tragedy of the whole AIDS piece. Lena, actually I do want to mention something here, because you started this interview referencing the book. So this is a relevant piece from my own gay journey.
Yeah.
Because I met my husband in 91, and I also met my birth mother in 91.
Right.
Now, my adoptive family was basically my family. It's primarily my mother, because my father passed away when I was really young, although I have a father figure in my life.
Mm-hmm.
Came in when, by the time I was 7, so that's who I think of as father, dad. And then I have a brother, and then my family had adopted 2 boys, me and my brother, my older brother. I mean, I pretty much came out to my family by my sophomore year in college.
Mm-hmm.
And they were cool and very accepting of me, of the people I was in relationship with, even some of the knuckleheads. I mean, my mother would, just wonder, how did you all end up together? But there was never any, sort of like auntie. In fact, the way I came out to my mother, I'll never forget this. This is my adopted mother.
Yes.
This was into my sophomore year at Harvard College. And so I was living in Los Angeles. I had gotten a job at the local NPR station out there. And in fact, I was seeing a guy, flight attendant for American Airlines, who has since passed away as well, unfortunately. Anyway, so I was staying with him, and so because of the tradition my mother and I had, because my parents never stopped me from leaving Cincinnati, so going to Harvard, staying in New York, blah, blah, blah. And not only did I go home frequently, I would always have my mother come and visit me for several weeks in the summer. So she came to Los Angeles. And so we were out at a shopping market, Rouse shopping market. She was just about to pick up some orange juice. And the brand she was going to pick up, the gay community was boycotting because of Anita Hill and all her craziness back then. Anita Bryant, rather. I'm sorry. Yeah, Anita Hill, God forgive me. Yes, Anita Hill she's been a major ally of gay folks. Anita Bryant. Yes. We're talking about like 1977. Mm-hmm. And so, now mind you, I hadn't formally come out. I mean, she's staying in a 2-bedroom apartment. I'm sleeping in the bedroom with my lover, right? But so I think she had that all together. Mm-hmm. And so I tell her, like, look, you've got to pick another orange juice because we don't drink that orange juice in the house because of Anita Bryant. And so she basically takes the orange juice, puts it back, picks another brand, and that was the extent of it.
Oh, wow. That was you coming out to your mother. Oh, I love it. I love it.
Yeah, it wasn't like, okay, tell me the story or whatever. I mean, again, a Libra mother, so you're not going to rock a world too much. Now, fast forward, so I met my biological mother in 91. And so we had a correspondence going back and forth by phone from January until June of 91. Okay. And then we finally decided in June we would meet each other in person because she's up in Buffalo. I was in New York City because I had come back from Brazil. I was in New York City. And so I decided, I didn't come out to her in any of the phone calls, but I said in our first face-to-face meeting, I'm going to let her know because I am not going to start this relationship hiding this part of me. I mean, she's a stranger. I'm a stranger. Right. At this point, I was really indifferent about how it went forward because I was not into that mindset that I was missing something. My adoptive family had been the best I could have ever hoped for and saved me from my perspective. So there was nothing to lose from my perspective, let's put it that way. And so I tell her, in our meeting, we're having lunch, and I say, look, I just want to let you know I'm gay. I mean, I just met Glenn, that's who I'm, that's my partner. So I just want to let you know. And to her credit, she didn't miss a beat. Now, fast forward on this, her health started deteriorating, like probably in the early 2000s. And so she became more confined to the house and then ultimately in a nursing home. And so she started watching, I forget what the station is, Catholic cable station, it's heavy right wing with a bunch of anti-gay crap. And so she says to me one day, because I was going back and forth now visiting her up in Buffalo. And so she says to me, I just want to let you know you're going to go to hell. Oh. Because you're homosexual, right? First of all, homosexual throws me off because I've never thought of myself as homosexual, in terms of the way I refer to myself. I mean, talking about wrestling with the word queer, homosexual was like, forget about it, right? So anyway, so I say to her, and you have to excuse my French, but I was so upset when she said it. I said, well, if you fucking a Catholic priest, because she was a nun, and that's all in the book, she's a nun, he was a priest. Yeah. So I said, if you're fucking a Catholic priest, it sounds like you and I are going to be together in hell, huh? Ooh, Joe. And to her credit, I mean, I really got to give it to her. She broke out laughing, and we never talked about it again.
Amazing. That is amazing. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, because we both knew that we had enough care for each other,
Yeah.
that this was a sore topic.
Right.
And she definitely loved the ground my father walked on. So the fact I would even be saying something like that as it relates to her and my father got her upset. So we never went down that road again. You know?
Right. Oh,
Yeah.
that's some sass, Joe. I love it.
I was so upset with her, Lena. I didn't mean to debase my father in any way or their relationship, because it really is a love affair they had. But she just pissed me off, because I knew she was getting like all this contamination watching this crap, and I would make sure she turned it off when I was there.
Right.
But whenever I just even caught a snippet of it, I mean, it's just like right-wing propaganda, Catholicism.
Next time, Joe and I talk about how he learned about his adoption history, connecting with his birth mother, and learning more about the story of his biological parents' relationship. We invite you to connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, or at www.queereverything.com. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.